again, everyone. It's Sam here and Serenity, who's bored already. We're here in the micro monastery. It's rainy today, so we're inside rather than in the garden as usual. And today I'd like to try and show you another couple of icons in the second of this little series on Easter icons. And after my struggle last time to hold my iPad and hold the icon book and have Serenity sitting on them or walking past or rubbing her head on the iPad, I'm sure many of you enjoyed all the interesting sound effects and blurry, furry extras, but this time I'm going to try something different, and I'm going to focus instead, I'm using my iPhone, I'm going to focus instead on images on the iPad which she can't sit on. So let's see how it goes. So here we are, we're still in Eastertide. I'm going to move across here and move in slowly to the icon for the Sunday that's just, actually no, this is Easter, this is the second Easter Sunday, and this is what is often called in the West Doubting Thomas. So in the church, Easter isn't just a chocolate-filled day, it's an entire season of Eastertide, and it lasts all the way from Easter Sunday, which was the middle of April this year in 2020, through to Pentecost, which is at the end of May. So we have lots of opportunities to reflect on what it means to have the presence of the risen Christ amongst us. What does resurrection mean? And we have various encounters with various different people to kind of give us different windows into answering that question about resurrection and Easter and what it means for us to live a resurrected life. And in the last video, in the first video in this series, I was focused on Mary Magdalene and the other women, the myrrh-bearing women. And now this is a week later, and the disciples are gathered in a room which has a locked or closed door. And in the icon you can see that closed door behind Jesus at the centre there. And he does appear initially on the very day on Easter Sunday after that encounter with the women. He appears to his male disciples. And on that particular occasion, one of his disciples, Thomas, is not present. And when he's told about this encounter afterwards, he says, I paraphrase, I won't believe in this resurrection until I've seen Jesus with my own eyes, until I've actually been able to touch his wounds and see that it's really him. And from this description, and then from this subsequent meeting a week later, where you can see Thomas is actually reaching out to touch Christ, from these two descriptions we in the West get this phrase, a doubting Thomas, which is usually used in a rather negative way to describe someone that has unreasonable doubts, or maybe has a lack of trust or a lack of faith. And yet that's not what is actually happening in these traditional icons. So it's helpful to have a look at these and kind of reconsider our assumptions, really. So in the icon, the inscription that's often written alongside Thomas or in relation to this icon is not doubting Thomas, but in the Greek it talks about the touching of Thomas. And I kind of hear that as both Thomas touching Christ, but also perhaps being touched by this extraordinary encounter. And in other languages, I think it's Slavonic, It's actually called the assurance of Thomas. So the emphasis is not really on his doubt, but on the fact that he finds assurance through this experience, through being able to ask reasonable questions, through being able to have doubts and questions, being able to inquire, being able to ask for reassurance and being given that reassurance, so that he's able to come to a place of authentic and personal trust that's based on an encounter, an experience, a real relationship. And I think that's a really different and important way of seeing this. And I think it's something that I certainly need to hear. I'm somebody who has a lot of questions about Christianity, about Christian faith, and I need to be able to ask those questions. I need to be able to wrestle with the things that trouble me or that I find difficult to understand or that I disagree with, and I need to be able to make my own authentic relationship with my tradition and with the person of Christ, whoever that might be for me. It needs to be genuine, it needs to be alive, not just something that somebody else has told me that I've just agreed to believe in because I think I should. So actually I found a lot of inspiration in this icon. So that was the second week of Easter. Yeah, and I'm going to move from that one. Again, I'm just going to come out a little bit because I'm going to have to just rest this for a moment, and we'll see how this works, because I've got to kind of get my screen to move to a different icon. And this is the one for the Sunday that's just gone. Let's see if we can get everybody in there. Very difficult to do this. I'm sure there's better ways of doing it, but I don't know what they are. And this icon is, well, this is actually a detail from a fresco, and the fresco shows the story from this recent third Sunday of Easter, which is when the disciples, or two of the disciples, and again we're going back in time here to actually the day of the resurrection. They're on a journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and along the way they meet with another pilgrim, another person that's also travelling the same way as them, and they get into conversation talking about what's been happening in Jerusalem, extraordinary events, the crucifixion, the fact that the women have seen the resurrected Christ. Lots of questions going through their minds about all this. And the person they're travelling with hasn't heard about this, so they're telling him about it, and he in turn is telling them about how this story fits into the kind of overall arc of the scriptures. And they come to Emmaus and they invite him to stop with them and to break bread with them. And at that moment where he breaks bread, and you can see the bread there on the table, they realise that this stranger, who they haven't recognised, is in fact Christ. And this is another powerful moment, again this kind of theme of, like we saw with the myrrh-bearing women and with Mary Magdalene, of initially not recognising that the figure they're encountering is a transformed figure. He doesn't necessarily look like what they expect him to look like. It's not the old Jesus, it's a new, radiant, transformed Christ. This is the promise of the resurrection, that we will pass through a death experience, that we will pass through difficulty, that there will be an ending to what we used to be, and yet something new will be born, something transformed will emerge out of that. Powerful words for this time, I think, a powerful conception. And there's a very interesting detail in this icon, and it's also in one of the passages that relates to this iconography, particularly in Mark, right at the end of Mark's Gospel, where it talks about Jesus appearing to the disciples in another form, or sometimes in a different form. And if you look at the Christ figure in the centre of this icon, he doesn't look like he often looks in icons, with the sort of long face and the long hair, the long beard. It's a different looking Christ. And this is a kind of motif that appears a lot early in the Christian tradition. There's an apocryphal text called I think it's called the Acts of John, and it goes back to the 2nd century, and that describes how Christ appears to women and to men in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes as a child, sometimes as an old man, sometimes as a comely figure, an attractive figure, sometimes as an unappealing figure. Sometimes he appears to be very solid and embodied. At other times he seems to be made of light and very spiritual. And I think this is a really interesting way of reflecting on this theme of initially not recognizing Christ in this new form, and then coming into a moment of realization, a moment of trust and recognition. And I think how this speaks to me, it speaks to my own experience, because I think we all have the potential to still encounter the Christ light, to still have a healing or a transforming encounter with Christ. And yet that encounter is not necessarily going to be what we expect. And Christ is not necessarily going to appear to us in the form that we might think. I had a very powerful encounter when I was in a lot of grief, like Mary Magdalene, after the crucifixion, after the death of my fiancé, many years ago now. And I had an extraordinary moment in that grief where I saw, I can't really describe it, it was like a kind of light or singing, or a kind of presence, a radiance, and it actually shone out through a flower, through a blue delphinium flower, in a way that was profoundly healing, that gave me a profound sense of interconnectedness, of love, of peace. And I think that was a Christ-like encounter. And it wasn't with a man with a beard. It wasn't with the scriptures. It was in a garden with a flower. And yet it changed my life. My whole life took a different course from that point. And slowly I made my way back towards a Christian faith that I had grown up with. I was actually in a Buddhist retreat centre at the time, feeling completely alienated from Christianity, and that was the beginning of a complete turning around in my life. So I think that's something, well, I invite you to reflect on that, to reflect on the fact that you might have an encounter with the Spirit, with the divine, with Christ in another way, in a different way, and that might be a resurrection experience. And, like Thomas, you might need to question what other people have told you. You might need to find your own way of really finding a living connection into an authentic faith. And I hope perhaps we can continue to reflect on those themes and find inspiration from these iconographic images, both from these last 3 weeks and in the weeks to come. And I hope to be back with you with further reflections. Thank you, and farewell for now.